hope that we don't trigger any more coffee cup incidents with breakage and kicking as per the instructions. I'm going to moderate this session from here, more or less, just because I think it's going to break up the dynamic a little bit and allow it to be interactive in different ways. And this particular interactive discussion is on post-conflict peace building, lessons for policy and civil society. I'm Keith Krause. I'm a professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute and also director of its Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building. So this is an issue that fits at the heart of both my own work and research. But what I want to do in this session is look a little bit at the ways in which what some people have called the international peace architecture have evolved since we could go back to the 1992 Agenda for Peace, which launched the idea of peace building within the UN system, or the more recent 2005 creation of the entire sort of peace building ecosystem in the United Nations with the Support Office and the Commission and the Peace Building Fund, and go forward for the next 20 years to today, more or less. But this is not, of course, just an issue about UN and international architectures, but it's also about what happens on the ground in peace building policies and practices as they've been unfolding over the last couple of decades. And so we have a couple of panelists or speakers today who have spent a lot of their time, a lot of their careers invested in different aspects of this. And I'm really glad to be able to pick their brains for the next 45 minutes or so. Owen Greene, who I've known for a very long time, is a professor of international security and development and director of research and innovation, which might be a key term here, at the Department of Peace Studies and International Development at Bradford University. And he's also done work with NGOs such as Safer World and others around the world and in many different contexts. And Charline Burton is the executive director of Search for Common Ground, which she modestly called a peace building organization. I think it's actually one of the largest peace building organizations that works in the field in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and probably in more than a dozen countries at any given time, 13. And I looked at their map, many more over the past couple of decades. So there's a wealth of experience from the field about peace building and what works, what doesn't work, and what we actually might mean by success or failure of this. So I'm going to go back and forth with a couple of questions and then hope to solicit some inputs from the audience and have an interactive discussion. And I'm going to start, I think, with Owen and ask for a couple of maybe just very general reflections to get us started about where do you think, actually, let me put it provocatively. Perhaps peace building is an idea whose time has come and gone, given the current multilateral crisis and geopolitical context. It might be easy to say that the whole edifice was a good experiment in that post-Cold War period, and the arc of history has bent in a very different way, and that maybe we should abandon the whole enterprise and start thinking differently about this. That's, of course, a bit of a provocation, but Owen, over to you.
Oh, thanks, and thanks, Keith, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this. Can I take the opportunity just to say in one sentence, this year is the 50th Jubilee year of the foundation of the Department of Peace Studies in University of Bradford, which was the first in the world, which was a comprehensive department, powering strong. And so we're celebrating that this year. And as part of that, there's a whole series of engagements, one of which is a conference in September, to which we hope you'll all be invited because Niels has promised to send out the invitation invited, but not necessarily expenses paid to participate, and that will be so anyway, let me finish that. Yes, on the so it's a big question, Keith, but thanks, because it's uppermost in the mind. Let me say that, in addition to being a researcher, I've been lucky enough, I guess is the word, to be engaged in the field in some sense or other, in probably the majority of relatively prominent so-called peace-building activities and things since the 1990s. And so I've seen a lot from wearing a whole range of different hats. So on the architecture, let me just first of all say that this word architecture, we need to be slightly cautious about how we understand that, because it can mean different things. And there's no doubt that there's a global discourse about peace building, and there are global institutions involved at every level that have their own mandates and understandings and policies, and that helps to frame a whole range of different agendas. But if you're thinking about architecture as being something with a little bit more specificity about how things are organized in terms of peace building, you have to be very cautious about generalizing globally. There is a global dynamic, and then there's a regional dynamic. So the architectures in Africa post-2000 with the African Union and all of that, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, are rather different to those of Middle East or East Asia. Above it, so you've got those regional, you've got sub-regional. It matters a lot in Africa, whether or not you're talking about West Africa with ECOWAS, as opposed to Central Africa, and so on, if we're thinking about architectures. And then at the national level, although if there's some sort of mandated into multilateral in some form, peace-building exercise or mission or something, pretty quickly, the first year settles into its own unique sort of architecture at the national and global level, as the different actors, mainly local but also international, navigate the external and internal constraints and opportunities and so on. So, and then those architectures can change pretty radically depending on the context. And so, the more at the point when the term architecture becomes useful, you need to be pretty aware of these different layers operating and the way they connect with the field. Similarly, you've got a whole range of different institutions involved, donors, international NGOs, local NGOs, and so on and so forth, all of whom see themselves as part of the same discourse and process, but they have different understandings of quite what that architecture is, what its priorities are, and certainly their role within it. So you've got quite a complex set of institutions, and that often relates within a government. So if you ask what is the US sense of its own role in that architecture, it depends very much whether you ask somebody within the US Department of Defense, the administration, the State Department, USID, and they will have multiple answers, some of which will get expressed more in some countries than others. And so that's just a safeguard. So within this provocation, so I think I'm a glass half full guy. So I don't think the peace building exercise is a useful sort of intellectual, experience that is now time has passed. But it's clear we face serious challenges as we move forward. Now, some of those challenges are essentially how to implement and proceed with all of the lessons learned that we have learned, but to different degrees in contested ways since 2005, 2006, about comprehensive peace building and all of that architecture, which involves a lot of UN mandates, UN missions, but international NGOs, regional, local, those sorts of lessons. And of course, the lessons will vary according to the local architecture. There are very different lessons in West Africa than there would be in the Pacific Islands, for example. And some of those challenges are very significant always. So, an awful lot of people that are professionally, my NGOs and, we're struggling with how to get the right balance between local initiative and local driving of peace building organizations. And at the same time, recognizing that if there's armed conflict, it broke out because of some local failures in some sense. And so in that sense, there has to be a national and international dimension to assist. So there's all of those complex engagements, who's accountable to who, how in practice do you delegate as an outsider initiative and authority to and empowerment as much as possible to locally, while at the same time recognizing that in a fragile context, choices need to be made about who you're empowering and what context. I would say one area that is, and just to wrap up that, but to address these challenges, one area that has, I think, is going to survive and remain relevant, although it's a constant struggle, is the acknowledgement that peace building isn't just for dedicated peace builders and so on. So there's been a whole narrative about, okay, for me, it's conflict sensitivity, from which I've been involved at the beginning. That's the jargon term. But it's essentially saying if you're running an education program, if you're running an anti-poverty program, if there's a governance issue, if you're working in a fragile context, let alone a post-conflict context, you'd better have a sophisticated understanding of how you might unintentionally do harm and how you can contribute through your education program to wider peace building. And I think that's robust, but it's hard to maintain at center ground, particularly as new foreign direct investment sources who are less sensitized to those issues come to dominate the terrain, China, but also, many others. The second one is obviously in the context of geostrategic tension. Where does that stand? And I think I would say, rather than say that it's it's an agenda that has emerged and then declined. One needs to recognize that there have always been pretty serious geopolitical constraints on how peace-building operations can operate. And those navigate in different ways. So I can remember in Nepal, for example, a context in which I was involved in many different ways. Geopolitics meant it had a very weak mandate, but local politics meant that actually it had a big footprint. And so one could do quite a lot, provided China and India were relaxed about exactly what you're doing. The moment they weren't, they could pretty quickly link with the elites that they understood in Nepal to put that off track. And that's similarly, you know, in West Africa now, the big puzzle is, how is it that ECOWAS, it used to be so proactive in preventing military coups, stood back when the Burkina Faso and Guinea coups, and Mali is a bit more understandable because of more complex politics. And so in that sense, but in the future, we're obviously going to be dealing with not just the local geostrategic concerns that probably one always had to navigate, but the bigger narratives which are out there, which are going to affect the attitudes. So one of the big deals, as it were, after the end of the Cold War, was that certain major powers, US, you know, European powers, Russia, China, decided there were certain areas of the world where they had sufficiently limited geostrategic interests that they would enable a process to emerge, which they didn't control, which we can call peace building. And I think those areas are going to be much harder to negotiate. With Russia right now, there's no framework for such a negotiation because, in a sense, one of their foreign policy agendas is to disrupt anything that looks Western, just to show that they can. But with China and other countries, I think they're much more pragmatic, and it's just really a question of how to make sure that the geostrategic competition in China doesn't descend to an extent where President Xi also feels that they'll align with that agenda. And I think there's a real possibility here. So finally, I think we're in for a rough 10 years as people recalibrate what's possible, because good practice in peace building is always a mixture of what you really ought to be doing in this complex situation according to the local conditions and what's feasible given the national configurations and the international configuration. So I'm a glass half full guy, but we'd better stay open and we'd better be pretty pragmatic, I think, but not lose some of the lessons learned. Just as an illustration, finally, POC, protection of civilians. A really big element of the emerging architecture, particularly since 2000, it's always there, but particularly since 2005-06, the experience is that in big countries, it's really hard unless you deploy an incredibly large contingent, unfeasibly large, and it's always ambiguous. And now in the new environment in which some of the big funders are, you know, more focused on other things, I think there are going to be very hard discussions about the extent to which that is realistic or feasible. It's never going to disappear from the mandates, but there's a real risk that failures in that context could delegitimize other worthwhile things.
Okay, thanks, Owen. I used architecture fairly deliberately because I wanted to then flip the narrative, because I think that it's a metaphor that, as somebody in the last session said, the language actually matters a great deal for how we think about these things. And buildings that architects build are inhabited by people, real people in real places. And I think that Charline and Search for Common Ground are very well positioned to give us the bottom-up view, if you want, and tell us how some of these dynamics play out in the work that you've done, in the places you've been, but also how it has affected the work over the last 20 years and maybe cast it forward. Are you as pessimistic as Owen about what some of the current developments mean for peace building work, or are you able to get on with business in spite of those things?
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'd say it's of course it's really important to keep the geostrategic dynamics into consideration, because we as peace builders and our colleagues, the partners we work with, we see the consequences of these dynamics on a daily basis. And a place where you may have been working for decades, building local architectures for peace and local capacities for peace, you may see that destroyed in just days. The way we're seeing that in Khartoum, where our team literally is hiding and fleeing Khartoum. After decades of work there, we're seeing we're no longer currently able to do any type of work. And so you may feel that, you know, there is despair there, you know, what's the use of doing the work we do? But we do believe that despite this kind of really harsh consequences of big dynamics, it's important and more important than ever to keep doing the work that we do. And I'd say even more so because of the way conflict is evolving. So I think, yesterday in the keynote, we talked about how conflict are evolving and going away from involving states. We're more and more involving non-state actors. We're seeing non-state actors, be it mafia, cartels, violent extremist groups involving conflict. And, they don't really want to sit at the negotiation table. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they have benefit in actually just making a mess out there. And in these circumstances, it's even more important to know who you're working with and empowering those who have the impact of building peace and enabling them be that peace actor. And, those are not always formalized actors. We're working with people who have, in the Congo, they run WhatsApp group of 10,000 people. And they have huge influence. That's a market lady in Sudan who is the one who negotiates what are going to be the taxes. Is someone, in Niger or at the border with Mali who's going to say, okay, how we negotiate with the rebel groups to make sure that we're able to still go to the market. How, for instance, in Kabul, our country director, how she's still able to go to the office while she's a woman Afghan person working for an NGO, technically ticking all the boxes for being unable to work. And so you need to be able to see how these people, the key people, more people that you influence are going to be able to overcome these situations where state is no longer always the person who needs to sit at the negotiation table. And so we've learned a lot of lessons. We're just one of the many peace actors, but one of the lessons that we learn is that you need to really adapt to these new conflict dynamics, finding who has that influence, but also there are still a lot of formal processes for peace. And so you need to also be able to be sure these peace processes, they're effective. And so I think the peace building in a peacemaking community is more and more aware, but we need more documenting of the evidence of why it's important to include more people around and at the negotiation table. I wasn't there yesterday, but I know there was a session on women, peace and security. We know that when you involve women in peace processes, you have 35% more likelihood of the peace accord being successful over 15 years of time later. We're also seeing that, for instance, when we work so much with youth, we looked at the 2000 peace agreements and peace accord since 1990. You have only 7% of them who mention youth. But at the end of the day, who's going to pick up the arms and go and fight? It's the youth. But who also has the power to harness peace? It's also these same youth. So by excluding them, you're just not able to bring the lasting condition for peace. You're not those sitting at the negotiation table. They are not broadening the issue. They're only scratching the surface. And that's also one of the reasons why, when you look at the number of conflict that were ongoing in 1989, half of them are still ongoing. Because you solve them, you think you have solved the issue, but it just resurges later on. So those are some of the things that we've seen and that needs to be addressed. It's increasingly being addressed, but we have an issue at documenting and proving that what we're doing is working. Sorry, I don't know if I answered your question clearly, Keith.
Well, it was meant to provoke you to reflect on this, but now I'm going to ask a specific question, which many of us will get asked when we talk to non-expert audiences. And they often say, well, can you point to a success? I mean, it's not Afghanistan, Sudan, DRC, and the difficulties and challenges, that's easy to list. But tell us a success story in this context, if you have one. And it doesn't have to be the whole process, but of course, where some bits of what has been tried under the liberal peace umbrella has actually led us down a path of sustainable peace.
Well, I think that if you look at the Mano River region, which is a place, so Liberia, Sierra Leone, those can be called successes. And it's also a place where a lot of investment was made in peace building. There were UN peace, make peacekeeping and peacemaking missions. There were a huge investment in governments, in justice, that were made there, but there were a lot of work done as well in where I'm most familiar, which is this community-to-community peace building, this giving the ability of people to have their issues talked to, exposed in a non-violent way so that they would be heard and addressed by their political elites, their political leader. It's a place where we and others, so many actors, enabled the issue of child soldiers to be addressed and deeply discussed within the community so that these child soldiers wouldn't be the warriors of tomorrow, where the seeds of conflicts were put on the table and discussed. So, I as we say in French, put my hand on fire, in the fire that, you know, we never know. It might happen again in the future, but I can say today we're at a place where peace building organization like ours closed their doors. 2 years ago, we closed and went away because we felt, you know, an organization like us has better spend their time in Afghanistan or in Burkina right now than we have to spend our time in Liberia or Sierra Leone. So this is an example that I can list, and I see you have more.
Could I just add something to that?
Yeah, briefly. And then before you do that, I'm going to say that people who want to ask questions, now is a good time to raise your hands, even if I don't recognize you immediately, because I want to move to that fairly quickly after Owen's answer. So, okay.
So I agree. I mean, one of the toughest issues, before I add some illustrations, is what are the criteria for success? I mean, and so I think in some areas, it's the criteria by some critiques and analysts, the criteria are set absurdly high. And so obviously, any post-conflict country that's emerged from a very bitter conflict of one form or another, whether it's across the country or anywhere else, is going to remain fragile in all sorts of respects, with abusive relationships and inadequate services for some time. And so in that sense, sometimes, you know, obviously mandates have to talk very ambitiously about what's there, but one has to, so the criteria for success is, are things manifestly better because they were labeled, because there was peace building activity that had this sort of multi-layer engagement. And I would agree that in Mana River, the Mana River region, even including Cote d'Ivoire, which is an ambiguous example, and so on, you know, those are very, I would say Nepal, for example, I would say that, you know, I support the findings of the human security reports as they used to come out, which was essentially that the decision by the UN, in the complex way decisions evolved, to intervene in conflicts early, in other words, before the peace is simply due to war exhaustion on the part of all candidates. That has, I think, led to many fewer deaths, injuries, and disruptions than was before. But it inevitably means, if you're intervening in if you're seeking to influence a conflict before all conflict parties have decided that the conflict is over for them, that inevitably means that everything is going to be much more hotly contested. So in that context, in that much more limited context, I would say in a range of places in the former Yugoslavia, of course, there are manifest areas in which that's not worked. You know, in other words, it's still very tough and getting worse. I would also add sub-regionally. So, for example, if you think about Ethiopia, I mean, in the sort of broader sense of peace architectures, obviously things have failed because of all sorts of national politics and relationships with Tigray and Eritrea. But there are whole areas in the southern part of Ethiopia, which I was very practically engaged with over a period of time, which, although it wasn't labeled officially by the UN as a war zone, tens of thousands were dying every year on intercommunal and other violences. Those peace processes really have changed in their dynamics and have been much more resilient, and that has been that has demonstrably, in my view, been because of the benefits of international support for local peace actors, not simply something organic to the local. So that's the reason why I'm a glass half full guy.
Thank you so much. Wonderful presentations. My name is Tony Raymond Chiravira. I'm a lawyer from Uganda. I'm also a law lecturer at University of Portsmouth and a researcher in transitional justice. So I'm very glad to be here. I would just love to ask generally, just to pick first of all from your conclusion by saying that peace processes supported by international organizations and international actors, do you think that that could also sort of derail peace building in practice if processes are seen as externally driven rather than mostly locally driven? But the big question I wanted to pose, of course, as a lawyer is, can we have peace without justice? Can we talk of just peace building without justice? Thank you so much.
I want to try and take 2 or 3 questions if that's possible. Okay, then answer it.
Yeah, I'll take it first. Thanks so much for your question. And I think it's an extremely important thing. It was in my notes. I'm like, I need to say that at some point. So you're my good excuse to say what I wanted to say. I think one of the challenges that we're seeing in peace building is that a lot of the norms are being set from the outside, not from where a conflict is erupting. And that's a big shift that needs to happen. We're working a lot on that, on what we call a grounded accountability. So shifting the accountability and shifting what it is that we do so that we respond to the needs of the people who are affected by the conflict, so that they are the ones who tell what needs to be done and what needs to not be done. How do you define conflict? The way you define conflict you said you're from Uganda, or the way you define it in Belgium is extremely different. Maybe whether you feel safe walking in the street at night. It may be whether you feel safe going to walk with your cattle. It may be whether you feel safe going to school. It may vary very differently from one region to another. So it's super important that first defining what needs to be done and what is being done and how it's done and whether it's successful or not, that this shifts to being determined locally. And it's really a challenge because on the one hand, you want to balance the global understanding of peace, having a collective impact and being able to speak about the collective impact of peace building actors. But also you need to have this granular understanding where you ask the people affected by the conflict how they define peace, violence, and conflict and what they need done. If there is $2 million, do they think it's most useful spent in a road or in peace building initiatives? And so this for now is not the way it's fully determined. And so the other aspect is, whether it needs to be localized or not. And yes, absolutely, it needs to be localized because, and you rarely are going to see peace organization who are foreigners from the conflict where they are. It depends where you sit. If talking about UN, it's a different story. But if you talk about peace organizations, you just can't do peace work or mediation work if you're a foreigner. So to explain, for instance, in our case, our teams, they're all local and they're all representative of, whatever ethnic or religious groups you have in the country. Otherwise, you just can't do your work. So that's something I feel is important to take into consideration. I'll let you adjust this question.
Okay. So just a quick comment. I mean, I agree with everything that's said on the peace process issue. There's a big debate. I mean, so that's obviously the big dilemma. So about 10 years ago, there was a big debate how to minimize the footprint of the international level in order it didn't so distort the political economy too much. But the experience was that maybe you can, but the lower the footprint, quite often that's a lower correlation that lowers the influence too. And so, so it's those issues can be navigated in an intelligent way, but it's tough. Similarly, on the local ownership. I mean, there have been some debates within the research, particularly within the research of on peace building, which have had a polarization between the international and the local, which I think has largely failed. In other words, there are particular formulations where there's the international and the local. I far prefer to talk about interpenetrating coalitions of the international and the local operating together in complex ways. Don't forget that if you're in most localities, somebody who's a native of that country who comes from the capital is seen as an external. They're not local. They obviously have, they have different links. They're recognized as being tightly linked to national elites typically, or something like that. And so in that context, they're part of the coalition, but it's a complex process. And so in reflection on the peace process, of course, there are many risks of a peace building exercise being conducted in a way that undermines or doesn't empower appropriately local peace, but more sustainable peace building. And there are particularly during periods of hubris and early in the 1990s, there are many egregious examples of that. But I think a lot of the lessons learned have been how to avoid at least the worst excesses of that and how to improve it. There's an additional challenge before, which is that no, let me go to the peace and justice issue. Otherwise, I'll go on. And that is that, of course, peace and justice are complexly intertwined, and therefore they have to be addressed together. But it's always a good enough relationship rather than a perfect relationship. In other words, there's no blueprint about how much transitional justice, holding accountability for what happened in the war, making that prominent. There's no formula as to how well that needs to be addressed in order to be able to progress towards a political settlement. That's very much in terms of local conditions. I've worked in areas where it always needs to be there, but I've worked in areas where the local population is willing to move on. We'll accept whatever it is, provided we can move on, and they'll go through some ritual maybe, which is often labeled indigenous peace processes, but it's essentially a symbolic ritual which says we agree to move on. And there are other areas where the grievances are so deep that unless you really have a deep engagement with that, you're not going to be able to progress. So there's always a dilemma, and I think this is one of those areas where the international justice industry is often tone deaf to those balances that need to be struck locally. So I'll leave it at that, but one could pursue that, so one can then pursue it. What's the role of the International Criminal Court? Sometimes it's been brilliant. For example, in Liberia, it just took one of the key actors out of the equation, allowing other processes to move forward. There are other areas in which it's contested. Finally, don't forget that whatever internationals ever do, since just because there's been the end of large-scale organized violence doesn't stop the end of the political struggle. There's always going to be a constituency who are interested in mobilizing resistance against measures that they think disempower them. And the easiest way of delegitimizing and saying this is just a X agenda, this is just a Y agenda. So one has to be robust in that. Norms are really important, but some international norms I think we should be unapologetic about. So in a lot of the communities areas that I've worked in, if you ask ordinary people who's members of their community, they're more likely to say, oh, it's my uncle who's in California and it's my, and we've got networks somewhere else, because their community is an identity-based community or a clan-based community. The international peace-building norm, which is community should mean people that are forced to live together to some extent geographically, is a very important international norm that actually requires active work and would not automatically emerge often from local peace processes unless it's a sort of conditionality for support. But when it does work, I think it can really build the links which help for some more sustainable peace.
Come back to you.
Good morning. I'm Sumaya Tanim. I'm fundraising officer at United Network of Young Peace Builders, UNOY, based in The Hague. Since we're like talking about the norms usually in the within the peace building organizations, as the peace organizations or consortia are increasingly focusing on localization, like empowering the local actors. Often, as I have experienced working in PV in Bangladesh and South Asia, that these localization efforts becomes confined to some established or already like working for a long time, those actors or organizations who often have their own biases. So the localization effort from the peace organizations or consortia are not necessarily being like communicated to the actual locals. So do you think it is actually possible to go beyond that, or how much are the bigger peace consortia willing to take that risk to go beyond that established local organizations to reach the locals?
Okay, I can take one more question and then I'm going to abuse my role as moderator for a second here, if there is one. Okay, so I actually wanted to say one thing about that question, which was triggered by Owen's remarks about people from the capital not being seen necessarily as local. I'm sure that people in Liverpool don't think anybody from London is local. So this is not confined to a post-conflict context. One idea that has come up, and it is in a context that a project that Safer World has also worked on and searched for common ground, is the notion of subsidiarity, which is deeply anchored in European Union thinking and actually has some deep sort of philosophical roots too, as a way to get beyond this local international dynamic and to speak meaningfully about at what level should decisions be taken by whom, and what role are there for higher and other levels of authority. And that I think might be at least one way to get a response, a beginning of a response to your question in that respect. So I'm going to I'll let you respond, but I'm going to give you one last small question as a provocation. We'll start with Charline maybe on that. So peace building was a bundle. It was like an operating platform, right? Transitional justice, as you mentioned, democratization, gender mainstreaming, a little bit of security sector reform, everything that we could think of got thrown together. And there's some contradictions and tensions in that. And almost in every one of those cases, the very norms that you mentioned, Owen, and others, are actually also under threat in our own societies. So how is it that we preach democracy promotion or gender mainstreaming in a context in which Hungary, Poland, the United States are undermining those very active norms? And maybe it would be better if we did peace building at home, to go with some of Martin's arguments from yesterday's presentation. So that's my last provocation, I promise. I'll start with you, Owen, if you promise to be brief so that Charline can get the last word.
So on the local coalitions, I mean, this is a challenge, and it very much relates to what I was saying before, that, you know, this sort of interpolation of the sort of contrasting or bipolarity between the international and local is just, I mean, obviously sometimes it happens, but it's not the best framework for understanding what's going on. It's the coalitions you choose to make, which are typically multi-level, with international NGOs being an international part of that. But obviously they often work hard to make sure they've got a very strong local representation and to be seen as local. So I think, I think one of the lessons is that, you know, and it's all bound up in what people phrase the local turn, which means different people to different people. But it means that if you don't have a peace building process or approach or architecture, if you like, in a country, which doesn't emphasize a high level of a degree of engagement with local communities in some sense at the local level, then I think the lesson learned is that is an unbalanced operation that will probably not work. On the other hand, lesson learned, it's very hard to scale up from local to regional to national. And so that bottom-up scaling doesn't work on its own. So therefore, the take-home that I, and for example, my NGO Safer World, has long established is the most important role for internationals is often not the support of the local, although that's there if it's wanted, but it's the facilitating the intermediation between local communities, the local state, the regional state, the national state, and international actors. I've worked and helped to design programs in different areas wherein almost the entire focus is to say, whatever's going on local, our job is to make sure the regional stakeholders and actors, which can often mean the ones that are unacknowledged, you know, the local intelligence services, the police, all of that, know what's going on and know enough about it that they don't try and stop it. Because, as I often say, there are many fragile states around the world, and all post-conflict states are fragile, but not all fragile states are post-conflict. I've never known a state that is not weak enough to crush any peace-building initiative it doesn't like. And therefore, so I think a lot of the international contribution to peace-building is often about creating the spaces within which certain groups can have the space to move, and ensuring that, because there's no sustainable peace without a national political settlement, but that takes some time to form, particularly in an inclusive enough arrangement in order to work. On this, on the bundle, I'm just trying to, yes, these tensions between different programs. Can you remind me of the nub of that question? Sorry.
The list can be long of things that have been.
No, I understand, but what was the nub? It was about managing that bundle.
How do they fit together?
Yeah.
Or do they fit together?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question, but and for me, it reinforces the point I made at the beginning that when you're actually thinking about architectures, they get developed within a national context. The overall architecture with comprehensive peace building is that in principle, international resources can be mobilized around all of those different spheres. And then there's the question of, and that those international resources might be labeled UN, they might be labeled donor, they might be labeled, you know, funded international NGOs and so on. The way they piece together, there are real tensions, but then there are real tensions in peace building anyway, between local peace building of a more sustainable way and getting a good enough political settlement at the national level, doing enough with the army that at least it's not massacring people occasionally and returning to barracks, et cetera, while still hoping in the medium term to have conflict present. I think the biggest tensions, given that, you know, need to stay short, the biggest tensions in real peace building operations over the last 10, 15 years is this number of spaces in which you have armed actors that actually don't care about the peace building process, but are either, as part of what Charline was saying, you know, just like chaos because it benefits from, or have a wider international agenda. So obviously, I was lucky enough to be very involved in the peace building process and UN peace building process in Mali in the 1994 to 1998. And in that context, all sorts of challenges were met, but they did not have to be met in the context of Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, in the context of ISIS, in the context of all of that, which obviously makes a dramatic difference to the tensions there. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, for peace building over the last 10 years is in that context, how to prevent the counterinsurgency and counterterrorism dog wagging the peace building tail, and how to make that the other way around. So to put those terrorist threats into some context so that they don't entirely dominate the agenda. But of course, that's very hard because good engagement with peace building requires local knowledge, which requires local interaction. And if that's deliberately not permitted because there's an active process, a campaign of targeting international peace builders or anybody labeled as peace building with assassination or whatever, then obviously that gets harder. And that's just part of the tactics and struggle of what happens in modern armed conflicts in those areas. But unfortunately, the area in which that is relevant is spread. And you can see in Sudan, there's no particular risks of that. But the fact that the norm against directly attacking international humanitarian workers has been degraded in other areas has meant there are far fewer political repercussions for the RSF and the army to do likewise, even if they're not, even if this is a more traditional framework. So we are operating in that context. And as I say, the big challenge, coming back to Keith's one, is how to do that in a way that doesn't essentially mean that the priorities of running a counterinsurgency or counter-terror don't sort of preempt a lot of opportunities in peace building. But that's a challenge, as you said, in every country, how to avoid the counter-terrorism direct enforcement measures overbalancing the sort of longer-term political and cultural aspects of preventing terrorism.
So you can pick and choose, actually. I mean, I gave a bundle of questions out there, one of which was about how these pieces fit together. And I would actually be curious to know how Search for Common Ground chooses which issues to focus on in which context, but also to respond perhaps to some of Owen's broader arguments about the way in which the changing nature of conflict has really shifted the kind of work that can be done and maybe even closed down the space. And anything else you want to add as a final reflection?
Thank you. Yeah, I do agree with what you've said, Owen. I think that one element that might be missing is really how we think about peace and who sets the norms for peace. And that also responds to your question in a way. I think what's really crucial and that we haven't discussed enough, and that's not being discussed enough, is who sets the norms and how can we make sure that this norm setting is set up collectively so that if there is tension, in Europe, France police might be misbehaving, that it's okay. It happens. We have our own issues. I'm a Belgian national. I know we have our own issues community-wise. That's okay. It doesn't mean I cannot be involved in peace building in another part of the world, and vice versa. I think we in Europe have lessons to learn from, Congolese, from Nigerian. And so it's about ensuring that everyone is welcome to the table of norm setting when it comes to peace and peace building, and that there is not a moral superiority from one part of the world. We need to leave that idea aside, and we need to be sure everyone has a say. And so it's about, and when you do that, then that's when you're able to exchange, truly recognize your mistakes, recognize the challenges that you have at home, and you're on equal footing to say, okay, those are the challenges we're facing. How do we address them collectively? There is no question of local versus national versus international. We'd then all be international to someone else or local. So that's, I think, really something we need to do. And also in the research that we do, we're talking, I'm not a research person at all, and I admire all the work that you are doing. Thanks for doing that. But I hear a lot about decolonizing research, and I think that's hyper important as well. We need that those who are most affected by the conflict and the consequences of conflict are those who are at the center of conflict research. And if you do that, then you're able to also demonstrate collectively the impact of peace building work, demonstrate the social return on investment. How much, when you invest $1 or €1 in peace building, how much money do you get back? And if you're able to do that collectively in a way that uses framework that are usable everywhere by local, sorry, let me not use local, by informal groups of youth from your country, from Indonesia, then they too contribute to the learning around the impact of peace. They don't need to have PhD from this or that big European university. They should be able to also contribute to that. So I think that's truly important. And then using the lesson of it to adapt the structures of peace and the funding for peace building. We're seeing that over, I think, 80% of peace groups, they work on less than $10,000 budget a year. They're not formalized, yet they have so much impact. How can we be sure to adapt the peace building money so that they too can benefit from it? So that is not €3 million, a DG INPA funding, and that's all that's available. You get this or you get nothing. Otherwise, you go to the elites group from the capital cities who are the only ones who have the capacity to manage that, or you go to the big international NGOs. So I think those are reflection themes that you as researcher can keep in mind. How can you keep your research also usable, accessible to those who are most affected by conflict so that they can contribute to it, and then we can in a way contribute to the decolonization of our mindset and the way we practice and we study peace building. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, that's a very good place, I think, to leave it as a challenge from the panel to the audience, or at least to some of the researchers in the audience. So thank you very much for your thoughts and your insights. And like the previous panels, this, of course, is going to spur more conversations over the coffee with the cups that stay at the back when we come for the next panel in about 15 minutes or so. So thank you very much for that.